Hello.
Hi, Professor Alston. Hi, I'm David McNeil. I'm Digital Director here at SCVO. Can you hear me okay?
I can, David. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear and see you very well. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to everyone that's joining us online to hear the session. Just to say again that my name is David McNeil. I'm Digital Director here at SCVO, the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. You may have been expecting Anna Fowley, our Chief Executive. Unfortunately, she isn't well this afternoon, and I've had to step in and take her place. So I will be taking the session. And we're very lucky to be joined by Professor Philip Alston, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. So thank you very much for joining us, Philip. I've got your kind of biography here, the kind of long and kind of career that you've had. I mean, a few highlights from you, obviously, that you're currently tenured professor at New York University and co-chair of director of the Centre for Human Rights and Global Justice. Editor-in-chief of the European Journal of International Law, lots of legal career, but also background in the NGO sector as well, having worked with the Anti-Slavery Society in London in the late 1970s, and being president of the board for Centre for Economic and Social Rights just now. And obviously your role today now with the UN Human Rights Council as Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, and that's why you're here today. Really to get some reflections on your visit to the UK and the initial report that you published on the 16th of November. There'll be an opportunity for questions on that report, and also for colleagues from across the third sector that are joining us to share their own views on poverty and the issues that you raise in your report and their experiences. So a bit of an interactive session today. This is one of the first big kind of webinars that we've done, so hopefully it goes okay. There's a few practical things I need to say before we actually kick off, which is that we are live streaming this event to YouTube as well, so it's public, so just bear in mind that when you're asking questions. And that you might be identified. There is a press release going out around this, so there may be press coverage of the webinar, again, when you're asking questions, to bear that in mind. On the practicalities, you should, if you hover over your screen with your mouse, if you're an attendee, you can see a chat icon. If you click on that, you can type a message, and we'll use that to ask questions. And the first session really is about, after Professor Alston's spoke, will be about questions. Then there'll be a session for next steps, but the majority is we want to hear your views, and I'll tell you a bit more how we do that when we get there. So I think that's the practicalities out of the way. I'll tell you a bit more about that as we start. But Philip, I'd just like to kind of invite you to give you some reflections on your visit to the UK and maybe what you learned from the UK and from Scotland.
Good. Thanks, David. I'm sorry I'm a little bit too close to the computer, but it's sitting on my desk and there's not a lot of room in front of me. So it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you, and I look forward to trying to answer any questions or comments that your members have. I'm now in the process of drafting the final version of my report, which will be sent to the government before too long. I should say immediately that while it wasn't possible for me to meet with the members of the SCVO when I was in Scotland, the submission that I received in advance of my mission from the SCVO was extremely helpful, and indeed tracked a lot of the issues that I ended up focusing on in my interim report. I guess a couple of things just to put on the table. First of all, one of the frustrations of this exercise is that my final report is strictly limited in terms of length. It actually has to be even shorter than the interim report was. And that means that I can't bring in a lot of issues that I would have liked to. I certainly can't go into the detail that it would be appropriate given the size of the challenges. The other dimension, I suppose, is to reflect a little bit on what has happened since the report came down. Obviously, it has received very extensive coverage in the media. It's been gratifying that the leader of the opposition and others have raised it consistently in Parliament. But of course, that doesn't itself achieve anything. What really matters is whether the government is prepared to consider some of the reforms that are highlighted in the report and to try to make the existing system more humane, if I can put it in those terms. The Secretary of State herself, Amber Rudd, has addressed the report in a number of different contexts, sometimes very critically, other times seeming to imply that there are issues addressed in the report that might warrant a full governmental response in terms of policy changes. But so far, apart from the delay of the introduction of the rollout of the next phase of universal credit, there haven't been a lot of detailed changes. So it's a time of waiting. The government is no doubt waiting to see the final report, and I guess we are waiting to see if there are going to be significant changes to a system of which I was very critical. I can't, of course, say anything very useful about Brexit, which is still continuing to take up most of the oxygen, understandably. But nothing that has happened since my report makes the situation any more optimistic. And I think we must assume that the consequences for people living in poverty will be particularly bad. And if GDP falls to the extent that the Treasury and others are fairly confidently predicting, then there will be a whole new set of people who will suddenly be plunged into increased economic insecurity and will thus start to discover the weaknesses that now exist in the overall social protection scheme. I think that's probably all I want to say by way of introduction. I'm very keen to hear from your colleagues, your members, and to get a sense of what is on their minds.
That's great. Thank you very much, Philip, for that introduction. And I know we're here to hear from people's views and thoughts that are joining us. So if I could ask people, first of all, in this session for the next few minutes to ask questions. And if you can, again, hover over your screen, click the chat and type in a message or question that you've got, and we'll ask them out. I mean, I think while you're thinking about the questions that you want to ask and when you're typing them away, I've got a question from a colleague here at SCVO, Shelley Ogilvie, about you kind of alluded to the government's reaction to the report kind of being a bit critical at times and, partly accepting. And is it a common reaction to governments by other governments to your reports? And are you concerned about how they will engage with those recommendations or do it?
I think it's fair to say that the great majority of governments are never going to say that a report got it right and that they got it wrong and they're going to fix things. I think that's just in the nature of politics. One doesn't want to be seen to be wrong, and certainly not to concede to an outside monitor that things should be done differently. But I don't have a problem with that. I think that's part of the system. What I'm anxious to do is to try to act as a catalyst to change, and whether it's linked in any way to my report or to the efforts that have been going on for a very long time by your member organizations and many others, that's not really important. What we need is a better deal for people who are living in or close to poverty, to enable them to live decent lives, and, as the government says, to pursue employment opportunities to the greatest extent possible.
I would encourage people to ask some questions in the chat. I suppose in terms of the changes that you feel might have the biggest impact on poverty and rights in Scotland and across the rest of the UK, what was there some standout things for you there?
For me, you're asking me that, yeah. I mean, my report is fairly detailed in terms of the sort of issues that I think need to be addressed. Obviously, much of it is built around the universal credit system, but it's also, of course, a deeper set of issues as I laid out. I think what's happened since 2010 is a real not walking backwards, but walking away from the commitments that were made in the post-World War II period based on the Beveridge Report and other initiatives. And the change in philosophy or ideology is reflected in the very large-scale cuts that have taken place. They go under the name of austerity, and both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have said at different stages that the period of austerity is over. But I think that is actually quite misleading, in the sense that, apart from the fact that there are many manifestations of the austerity policies that are still very firmly in place, what's happened in the period since 2010 is a fundamental realignment of the system. And there is no indication at all that that will be reversed. So those who might have thought, based on what George Osborne and David Cameron said back in 2010, that if the economy improved, there would be a return to a comprehensive safety net. I don't think that is likely at this stage. And so to say that the period of austerity is over tends to mask the depth of changes which have been implemented in the overall system in the UK.
Great. I think we'd really like participants to share later on as some of their experiences of the impact of austerity and universal credit, and from people working at the front lines. The questions have started to come through thick and fast now. I mean, I think that our first question here from Brian Toole is really about the Sustainable Development Goals, and that the UK must present its voluntary national review this coming July, with the UN commenting about how they engage, and obviously no poverty being the first. In your report, you mentioned an increase of the likelihood of child poverty up to 2022, and in the final report, will you be referencing the SDGs and the fact that the UK has signed up to them?
I think it is an important opportunity for both for the UK and for civil society actors to scrutinize the record on poverty elimination when the SDG report is presented this summer. It has to be said that that process has been fairly disappointing to date in terms of the review by the high-level political forum. But the most important part, I think, is the domestic debate. In other words, it's not what happens in New York that is really going to transform things. It's whether the government will engage domestically in a reflection on what progress is being made towards meeting the particularly goal 1 of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Great, and I think it's just a point to kind of give a mention that Scotland's Sustainable Development Goal Network, which is civil society led, and the Scottish Government are today launching a call for evidence on Scotland's progress towards the SDGs. So it's kind of very relevant, and I would encourage people that are taking part to visit globalgoals.scot to submit their evidence. So that would be great. There's a few questions come up that relate to the impact of UK welfare policies on particular groups. Would you like to say anything more particularly on either the impact on women in particular and on disabled people, which is another group that's come up there? What's been the impact of UK welfare policies on those two groups in particular?
Well, I made a fairly strong statement in the press conference at the end of my visit to the UK, where I suggested that if a group of misogynists had got together in a room and tried to design a welfare policy, they would probably be pretty happy with the existing setup and wouldn't feel the need to change too much. It's, of course, common for welfare systems in many countries to be particularly harsh towards single mothers in particular. They are a group that male policymakers and others are very happy to blame for their own predicament. And to become moralistic and say that they got themselves into that situation and it's not for the state to bail them out, etc. But what we see certainly is that the situation of single parents, who are overwhelmingly women in the UK, is really grim. And the emphasis on 35 hours of job searching, on making yourself available for work with little regard paid to the demands of childcare and so on, are also ultimately quite punitive. I think there has been a lot more attention since my report on the importance of trying to disaggregate payments to different household members so that women are not disadvantaged, payments under universal credit and so on. But I think overall there is no doubt that women are severely disadvantaged. You also mentioned people with disabilities. It's quite striking the number of stories that one reads in the media that resemble the storyline in I, Daniel Blake. In other words, stories about people who have clearly dramatic disabilities, but are assessed as being fit for work and told to simply get off their bottoms and get out there. And that could be, I think the general responses are, well, these are isolated cases, you know, that sort of thing happens occasionally. Yeah, we got it wrong in that case and the other case. But I think what I see is much more of a pattern where the significance of disability and the disadvantage that goes with many forms of disability is greatly played down, which leads to less preparedness to take account of the very specific needs of people with disabilities. And that goes against the broader trend, at least in the Western world, where we are belatedly starting to realize the extent to which people who have the full set of human rights and the full determination to contribute to society have been very arbitrarily precluded from doing so by policies that are simply insensitive to their particular needs. And I think certainly what I've seen of welfare policy in the UK is now tending to look very unsympathetic to the needs of people with disabilities.
And I suppose there's a few questions come up around the policy and the differences between the UK and the Scottish government. And the initial report did reference some of the mitigation that's been put in place, but that those were not without its challenges, things around the Scottish Welfare Fund. Did you identify where Scotland could perhaps do more or is actually doing quite well in comparison within the constraints it has with the UK government policies?
I think Scotland is doing well in terms of mitigation. There's a clear commitment to doing things differently. There's a clear resistance to the basic philosophy, which is underlining a lot of the reforms that are having the greatest impact in England and Wales. And that philosophy is that people should not be able to rely on assistance from the state, that local councils and others should not be in a position to be providing much assistance beyond what is required statutorily. But of course, what the Scottish government can do is limited by resources. They're already spending, according to their estimates, £125 million a year just to mitigate the worst aspects of some policies that are coming from London. I think that the moves to consider a human rights charter, to ratify or to incorporate the Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scottish law, and those sorts of initiatives can make a very big difference in terms of ensuring that the approach adopted by Scotland to these issues really is very different from that which currently prevails in England and Wales.
And there's actually a specific question on that from around the UNCRC, and given it's the 30th anniversary this year, and Cara Brown here is saying that talked about with you in Glasgow. Do you think you may have a recommendation in your final report around the UNCRC for the UK?
Well, I mean, it's most relevant in relation to the proposal which I discussed with the First Minister in Scotland. I'm not sure that the overall UK government is likely to be moving to give the convention a higher status, but I think Scotland could indeed set the way there, and that would be highly desirable.
Great. I think there's several people commenting on the kind of frankness of your kind of report and the media reaction. Questions around that thing that you acknowledged, that there's beginning to be, you know, even this week, Amber Rudd acknowledged that the increased use of food banks was partly down to problems in the rollout of universal credit. Do you sense recently a kind of shift in the attitude of government to change, make some changes? And also, do you think there should be kind of any stronger mechanisms to follow up on those recommendations?
Well, there are, I mean, this is not a scientific statement, but there are, I guess, 3 levels of reaction to a report like mine. Well, first, let me say, in terms of the frankness or whatever, I do think that these engagements between governments and special rapporteurs are potentially very helpful. I regret the extent to which they are often sort of mired in bureaucratic language that is fine for a handful of bureaucrats and UN officials, but doesn't mean anything to a broader public. And so I've gone out of my way just to try to express these issues in terms that might resonate with those who are working on the issues in the country. And the beauty of my position is that I really am independent, and I'm not beholden. I'm not looking for another appointment somewhere. I'm not looking for an extension of my existing appointment. I'm not paid for what I do. And so I am very fortunate to be able to speak openly and without much inhibitions. But to go back very roughly, there are 3 levels of response to a report like this. The first is real dismissal. Just, you know, this is nonsense. We don't care. We're not doing anything. The second is, this report seems to have got some traction with the public. It resonates somehow, so we better be seen to be doing something. Let's see what we can do without disturbing the essential trajectory of the policies. And the third level of response is, well, this is not a report coming from, as the Americans say, out in left field or coming from nowhere. It's a report that builds on a lot of evidence that's been built up in the country. It's reasonably well founded, and it identifies some major issues which really do need to be addressed in a substantive and meaningful way. I think the first option is no longer on the table. I think the report has got enough uptake by community groups and by parliamentarians and various government bodies even, that it has to be engaged with. And so now the issue is whether the response will be at level 2 or level 3. It's certainly better than nothing to have some sort of tinkering with the system. But of course, what the report is really seeking is a deeper rethinking, and that very much remains to be seen.
Thank you. There are still some questions to be answered, but I know you were keen to hear from colleagues here as well. So I'll ask you perhaps for some reflections on, or kind of to identify the next steps and opportunities for change. But for the attendees, what I'd quite like you to do is, if you've got a particular experience that you would like to share, kind of stories about the work that you've got, we would like to kind of bring you into the conversation, allow you to share that. And how to do that is if you again hover over your screen and click the button to raise your hand. And then I'll ask you to join in a few minutes time and speak if you have a microphone. But Philip, yeah, just on the practicality as well, we're waiting to see if people raise their hands and to have a conversation. What are the next steps for you, the opportunities for change, and perhaps some thoughts on where you've seen other countries take forward actions around similar characteristics?
Well, I'm basically a solo actor. My contribution is to analyze the situation and try to tell it as I see it. But I have limited capacities to undertake sustained follow-up. And indeed, the reality is that that's for the people of the country themselves. I certainly won't walk away from the situation. I will continue to follow it quite closely. I will be happy to try to draw attention to specific issues as things unfold. But really, the impact or otherwise of my report is pretty much in the hands of people like your members. If they can take it up and do something with it, then it will be one of the factors that contributes to changing, ideally, their mentality, but certainly some of the most problematic policies. If people ignore the report, which is their prerogative, then it will, of course, sink without further impact. But certainly I single-handedly can't achieve the results that are needed. This is it's an issue, it's a political issue for those in government and those who would want to be in government, to be persuaded to see the persistence of poverty, and certainly on the dramatic scale that it exists in the UK, as a major political issue, something that really does need to be addressed in a way that brings results, not just changes a bit of legislation or regulations here and there.
That's great, and I'm sure many of our members are being delighted with the report highlighting, and as you say, in such a frank way, the issues that they've been talking about, raise the profile, and gives them additional weight to continue to challenge government and others to address the issues around poverty. So again, what we'd like to do is, if people would like to talk and share their experiences here, to raise their hand virtually by clicking on the link, and we'll join you into the conversation so you can actually speak to us. There's an interesting, while we wait on that, there's an interesting kind of bit of debate in the chat here around food poverty and food insecurity being a specific thing, and also is that just segmenting the issue about being an overall there's a comment around we need to stop segmenting poverty, that food poverty, fuel poverty, and child poverty is all poverty. I don't know if you have a view on that issue around the different aspects of poverty, or do we need to tackle the bigger issue around lack of money?
Yes, no, I think that's a very important point. I mean, it's easier said than done, of course, because if we are working in the field, there is a strong temptation to say, well, I work with children, or I work with the elderly, or with people with disabilities, or I work on food or some aspect of healthcare or whatever. There's a lot of reasons why that takes place, but it is nonetheless true that the result is a siloing of the overall challenge, of which each of these manifestations are just one part. I mean, that in some ways is the privilege that I have, because my focus is on the overall situation of poverty and its relationship to human rights. And I don't need to be siloed, and I have the luxury of talking at a level of some generality. And I think that probably is one reason why the report had the impact that it has, because at one level, my report could be dismissed very easily by people saying, look, there's nothing new in this. You know, for every paragraph that's there, you could find a huge report by one of the major foundations or trusts or university outfits or voluntary organizations or whatever, which gives a lot more detail than Alston, is based on much more empirical work, etc. And all of that's true. But what I was able to do was to sort of ride on the shoulders of those reports and try to bring things together so that there is a more integrated perspective. But it's certainly true in terms of policy advocacy, both in Scotland and more broadly in London, that one does need to keep the overall picture in sight, because no matter what you do specifically for children or for the aging, if the underpinning philosophy is still that there shouldn't be government assistance and that taxes should be reduced to the point where there is no money for local authorities to step in and provide help, then it doesn't matter what you're doing for children or any other particular group, you're going to be frustrated. So the overview is really very important.
Thank you. Again, I'd invite people to, if you don't want to raise your hands and share your experiences using your kind of microphone, if you could just type them in the chat. Really, we're looking for, you know, your opportunity. This is your opportunity to talk about your own reflections and opportunities for change around poverty in Scotland and the UK as a whole. So please do, as well as asking questions, share your reflections and opportunities for change. I think Susan Murray there, kind of following up about is the challenge for the third sector to stop working in silos, and if we want to see real change in the sector, it needs to change how it advocates for change on poverty. So a kind of question there about, you know, do we need to work more collaboratively around that agenda of not segmenting issues too much?
Well, I guess I mean that, of course, is the role of peak bodies like the SCVO. I guess, as I said, I think inevitably most of us who work on issues do end up going into some particular dimension of it. you know, I'm a lawyer. A lot of my colleagues will focus their efforts on legal aid or the functioning of the legal system, but it still is true that one has to say to them, you know, your efforts are not going to get all that far unless the overall system is also changed. So, but I think there are different roles to be played by different groups. I don't think we can ask every group to take on every issue or to look at the broad picture necessarily, but someone has to be doing it. That better be you, David.
That's a nice challenge to put back to us, and one we're kind of happy to take on. We've got a comment here, I suppose, on their experiences from Ruth Mindell. Notes that in the recent Citizens Advice Scotland Food on the Table report, that 45% of their survey respondents were actually in full-time or part-time work, that 40% of those worried about food running out before there was more money to buy more. So it's that in-work poverty piece, and that a lot of the work focuses perhaps on the extremes of poverty, but their work, I'm assuming, is around helping people that are struggling to pay the bills and the essentials, and prioritise. It's again that thing that you're perhaps not in the extremes of poverty, but the money to choose between heating and food at the end of a week is a challenge. And a kind of comment here from Polly Nolan, that the Scottish Campaign on Welfare Reform is a collective of third sector organisations working together on all areas of poverty mitigation and policy, and that committee is well attended, and it's had some success. So there is that collective in Scotland that looks at welfare reform and the impact and how we mitigate it. There's already some collaboration going on around that. And obviously your work, if you want to comment on that issue around perhaps in-work poverty, obviously you're a special reporter on extreme poverty and human rights in your thing. What's your view on the kind of in-work poverty issue and how that affects UK and Scotland?
Well, I think that's I mean, it's true that my mandate, as the UN calls it, focuses on extreme poverty, but it's not possible to isolate that concept from other forms of poverty. And I think what we also know is that whatever the statistics about people who actually live in poverty, there's always a significant number of people who live very precariously out of poverty. In other words, people for whom one slight mishap, someone getting sick, a car accident, something happening to their accommodation, will move them into poverty. And so they are sort of hovering above that threshold, but their existence is precarious. There's no doubt that there's a huge problem of in-work poverty. And if we look at all the various reports that are coming out these days, many probably, on the future of work, the future of employment, what we see is great concern that there will be wholesale replacement of people working in a wide range of established jobs, and they'll be replaced by very low quality job opportunities, which will be paid at minimum rates. And as that growing informality, as the labour market people call it, grows, so too will the precariousness of people in terms of being able to survive on a combination of inadequate wages with no broader social safety net support, because the safety net is being cut back, certainly in the UK, very systematically. And if you are then living on the margins, you don't have the luxury that you might have had 20 years ago of being able to get support in times of need. So I think it's the problem of in-work poverty is a very major one already, but it's likely to get significantly worse.
There's a comment here from Cara Brown, who is from the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland, and I think you visited a group of young people there. And I think the view from Cara is that the number of the young people that she's spoken to since the visit were really grateful. You'd be pleased to hear that the children that you met in Glasgow felt listened to and appreciate the opportunities. They felt that things aren't getting better and they're never asked what their views are. So I think the opportunity to be heard and share their experiences was really appreciated.
Well, I mean, I should also take the opportunity to thank the Children's Commissioner for helping to set that up and for really setting the example in terms of outreach to children and really engaging with them as serious rights holders, as we say. And I think that is validating for children, and I think it makes a very big difference in terms of the way in which we understand their rights and their needs, and helps policy formulation.
Great. Meanwhile, in the chat, the debate around that collective campaigning on welfare reform and poverty continues. I think there's Shelley from SCVO here wants to highlight that that the Scottish campaign on welfare reform is open to all organisations that agree with their manifesto principles, and there's a contact to join. The steering group meet monthly to discuss the priorities, and more information's on the CPAG website. So, or contact Shelley here at SCVO for more information. And I think Susan Murray thinking actually it's great that we've got a collective, but actually we should be doing more as individual organisations who are responsible for a single issue, to make that bigger call and louder call for systemic change. Pauline Nolan here, talking about the role of advice and advocacy being important, and asking what you think of, there's going to be a £600,000 cut, the Scottish Legal Aid Board's cut to Citizens Advice Scotland, and so the big cut to Legal Aid Board, and it provides essential benefits advice to people across Scotland. Citizens Advice Scotland, that provide advice, legal aid, being cut. As Scottish Minister signed off on that. What do you feel around the kind of role of advice and advocacy for people, and the importance of those services often provided by the third sector?
I think one of the issues that I regret not having been able to devote more attention to in my report is the dramatic change in access to justice, to use the standard phrase. The quote reforms that have been introduced in the UK are stunning in terms of their decimation of the availability of legal assistance to large numbers of people in need. And it's sort of puzzling what one can do under the rubric of austerity. And it would be interesting to imagine a politician who wasn't able to invoke austerity, instead getting up to give a speech which says, we've realized that too many people are getting access to legal aid, to legal assistance. we want to radically cut down the number of people who can vindicate their rights in any way, and especially by going to court. And presumably there'd be a huge backlash saying, no, 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 you can't do that. But under the guise of austerity, the changes that have been introduced and the implications in terms of any concept of the rule of law is pretty amazing, I must say.
Yeah, I think it comes back to that point around the philosophy that people that you've talked about, and there was a comment earlier that have we lost sight of the individual, how to make things based around people's rights and allowing people to claim what their rights are. There's a specific comment here from Amanda Heenan that Westminster policymakers seem deliberately disconnected with the impact of their policies, that when they're presented with evidence of the huge increases in homelessness, of the use of food banks, the responses to reel off, we've invested however many billion in local authorities and NHS, and are required to do impact assessments and have had decisions challenged by judicial reviews. But that doesn't seem to have touched the UK government. So there's quite clearly a disconnect, a buffer between the Westminster policymakers and the impact of their policies. How do they create that buffer?
Well, of course, it's complicated. I mean, it's a bit more difficult than that description would suggest. The Conservative government has, it of course is not a majority government, but it has the support of close to a majority of the people. It continues to poll reasonably well. That means that there are a lot of people who support the policies. And I think one of the defining policies of the Conservative government has precisely been this radical set of cutbacks in welfare, in local government, in legal aid access to the courts. And so it's not just a handful of MPs in Westminster, it's a large number of people in the UK who have not yet been convinced that the major assault on the standard of living, the quality of life of people in the bottom 20% will actually come back to have a major impact on everyone. That Britain will look differently in the years ahead from how it looked in the past. And I don't think people realize that. I think it is still much more able to be presented in class terms, that, well, we're fine, we're doing well. People who haven't worked as hard as us and made enough money as us are finally being reined in and not given handouts and so on, but that's their problem, not ours. And I think we've lost the focus on the fact that building a fair society is not only in the interests of the poor, but is in the interests of everyone. It affects just the whole way the country functions. But I don't think that has yet been brought into the political mainstream.
Yeah, the public debate doesn't seem to be quite there yet on that. We've only got 5 minutes left. There's a couple of specific questions that I've missed out or comments. One was around a group we've talked about the impact of universal credit on women and on child poverty and disabled people. Is there any impact specifically you see on Black and minority ethnic groups and poverty in the UK?
Yes, I mean, I think that there are quite a few reports that show that a lot of these cuts that have been made have a very significant and quite particular impact on ethnic and racial minority groups. It's difficult in some ways, of course, to separate out the assault on asylum seekers who are invariably seen as coloured in some way. They're either black from sub-Saharan Africa, or they're Arabs from Syria or some other country. And so the preparedness to adopt highly punitive approaches to asylum seekers is also linked, I think, to a sort of underlying racial dimension to a lot of the welfare policies. So I have no doubt that they do have a very significantly detrimental impact on those groups.
There is, just as we kind of draw to a close, a few quick things, although these, I'm not sure the answers will be able to be very quick on these things. There was a comment from Frank McKillop around the interim report referring to the, record levels of employment, but the thing about in-work poverty that we've already mentioned, the low paid insecure work and unable to get the hours they need to learn and live on. Do you think we need to review the language and measures that we use to give a more accurate picture of the labour market and that in-work poverty piece?
Well, I think the government has been remarkably successful in holding to a set of talking points that their public relations people have given to them. The Prime Minister rolls out these talking points every time she's asked about poverty. And of course, what they do is conceal the real issues. There's a significant number of indicators which need to be taken into account, and not simply a focus on the number of people who are in work. That doesn't address the issue of people of in-work poverty. It doesn't address the issue of the large numbers of people who are still not in work or not able to find enough work, and thus really having a very tough time under the existing system.
I think that links, there's a few comments generally about, Lucy Higginson notes that conversation links to government targets on extreme poverty. If you're drowning, that you don't say that you're extremely drowning, and making these different shades of poverty is moving government responsibility, making it easier to take credit for high results, and that's similar to what you were just talking about. I suppose the last question here links to that from Rhiannon Sims, that a lot of the debate around the new measures of poverty in the UK, there's a new measure put forward by the Social Metrics Commission. Do you have a particular view on which measures the UK government should use in measuring poverty?
I think I, along with many other people, have been very surprised by the extent to which the Social Metrics Commission approach has got broad-based support. I think there's very strong agreement that the existing approach and the failure to come up with measurements that are agreed upon is deeply problematic. And I think the alternative put forward by the Social Metrics Commission is probably an extremely good one. One could argue about some of the details of it, but that's not the point. There needs to be a consensus basis for policy debate, and that seems to be better than anything else that is likely to come along for a long time. So I would be very supportive of it.
Great. Well, we're about to draw to a close. So on behalf of all the members that have joined us live here and that will be viewing the recording, I would like to thank you, Philip, for taking the the time out, what's no doubt a very busy diary, to come and speak to us. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Just a quick reminder that the engagement around the Sustainable Development Goals and the opportunity to share what progress you think has been made in Scotland is available now by visiting online at globalgoals.scot. So we'd be very grateful if people could join in and share their views on progress being made against the SDGs. So once again, thank you very much, Philip, for joining us, and we really look forward to seeing your final report, and we're really grateful that you're raising the issues that lots of our members have talked about and giving us the further evidence to campaign and change. Somebody asked, is there light at the end of the tunnel? But I think that's what we're all trying to achieve. So
right.
Thank you very much.
I think if there is light at the end of the tunnel, it's people like your members who will create it. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk with you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Bye.
Bye.